He even bragged to the lad about defeating a huge ancient crayfish, but that seemed useless against those humans who had beheld and survived against really horrible monsters. The lizards didn't even know how to use a bow, let alone the secret weapons that warriors have. So carefree that they even talked about their problems without thinking about the consequences. It was a foolish decision. They shouldn't have trusted such a despicable man. Owen summarized, getting up from the ground. Even though he'd said he shouldn't be trusted, they kept doing it, driving the guy up the wall. He thought he was just a charlatan. After one last look at the inscriptions he had been drawing in the sand, he turned around and went back to his tent. By morning, almost all the symbols had disappeared, hiding the fact that someone had been there. A huge commotion went up in the village. A multitude of feet ran from the side, raising a huge amount of dust. Lizardmen arrived in their settlement, shouting out things here and there. Shunin came out to greet them with open arms. To this, Rakrak thanked them for such friendly hospitality. He hoped that this exchange would only strengthen the friendship between the two tribes. Toad also supported his guest's wish. All the lizards came in full uniform, spears in hand. Rakrak was ahead of all questions and asked them to ignore the fact that they had come with weapons, explaining that he was afraid he would meet Cockatrice halfway. Shunin only mentally gloated at the foolish lizard folk leader. He thought the idiot wouldn't even believe him if he told him that Cockatrice could not be fought with a spear. Toad was cunning enough to even think of a plan ahead of time. When the banquet began, he was going to get his guest drunk and fire a poison arrow. Rakrak was distracted at this time and asked where Owen was, to which the son of the Frogman chieftain shouted at the top of his voice for the lad to appear immediately. He was standing not far from where the banquet was being held and seemed to be drawing something on the ground. There were only lined paths on which the dishes were placed. Crates and bags of food were visible in the background. They seemed to have decided where Rakrak would sit. Sit there, Shunin pointed ahead and asked him to say hello to Owen, and he went to make sure the food was cooked properly. So be it, the lizard replied, pulling a smile onto his face. Getting close enough to the guy, he called out to Owen, who was waiting for him to come. In his place, the lad wrote some text that needed to be read. When Rakrak and the warriors are seated, the banquet will begin, the boy said with a smile. To the lizard chief, it sounded like a warning of danger. Owen, however, with his feigned smile, went on to say that it was a fun banquet that would promote peace and friendship between the two tribes. While he was saying all this, he was pointing his stick at his text, which consisted of only one symbol that Rakrak had taught him, lies. They were written all along the length of the seats on which the chief and warriors were to be seated. Taking the hint, Rakrak began to pull the water buffalo skull over his head while calling out to Ur. The lizard's pupils became as narrow as a cat's, and with anger in his voice he ordered the warriors to begin. Ur waited for nothing more. Gathering all the strength in his hand, he took masterful aim with his spear. The weapon flew straight into the frog warrior's head. The spear pierced through the skull, causing the body to fall to the ground, terrifying the others. Kill all the frogmen, Rakrak ordered his tribe in a cold and low tone. The warriors moved forward without hesitation. One by one the frogs fell to the ground, pinning themselves with their spears. They didn't even have time to do anything with their bows. Some of the defeated green creatures turned to Owen before they died, blaming him, for he knew everything. Branding him a traitor and blaming him for their deaths. Rakrak's casual face expressed no emotion, only drops of blood dripping from his mask, leaving a trail. In a short time the entire clearing was strewn with the bodies of frogmen holding arrows on their belts that had not saved their lives. The chieftain walked around the area listening to the report on the progress of the sweep. During the attack on the warriors, many of the frogmen had fled following Shunin's example, which meant that they would soon be hit by a hail of arrows. They need not worry about the arrows, however, because we have a backup plan, one of the warriors said to the leader. But that was unnecessary, for they had Owen, Rakrak said with a smile on his face. There was something in his plans that he had to do. The tip of the arrow the frogman held was coated with some kind of poison. Shunin and the men he'd gathered in the meantime, armed with bows, were heading toward the banquet site where the black-skinned lizards would be. He was mad as hell, and blamed Owen, who in his opinion was to blame for what was happening. Turning to his warriors, he asked irritably if they had passed on his orders, to which one of his subordinates replied that they had. He reported that he had summoned all the warriors of the village and put them under the command of the Oboi warrior and ordered them to attack the black-scaled lizards, while the lizards in the village were ordered to hold back those until reinforcements arrived. Hearing this, Shunin angrily shouted that they should avenge such meanness from those. Pointing his finger at the black-skinned lizards, he shouted furiously and ordered his men to fire and destroy the enemy at all costs. In the very next instant, a rain of poisonous arrows flew straight towards the Rakrak tribe. Even if the arrow could not kill the lizard, it would still die from the poison. However, they also had a trump card in the form of the shields each warrior was armed with. The next moment the arrows hit the shields and fell to the ground with a clang. Shunin and the rest of his warriors were amazed at what they had seen, for they could not have imagined that the black scales would have anything to counter them. And even more so that they could neutralize one of their strongest weapons and one of the weapons of which they were so proud, namely their bows. Rakrak and his warriors rejoiced that they had won a small victory. Shunin, angry at his failure but not about to give up, ordered his warriors to keep firing if they saw them trying to advance. The next moment, however, his attention was drawn to the smoke that appeared out of nowhere. Puzzled, he wondered what was happening. He looked again at where the black-scaled lizards were and found that he could no longer see them properly because of the smoke, which would greatly reduce the effectiveness of his bows. However, there was still one more question, and that was where was the smoke coming from? At the same time in the village of Frogman, someone had set a pile of firewood on fire with a torch. It was none other than Owen, who, with torch in hand, stood watching the fire spread throughout the house. His kin ran up to him and began to panic, asking why he was burning down the village. Seeing that he did not answer, one of them asked if it was also Shunin's order. Owen replied that it was not, but that he had been asked to do so by the leader of the black-scaled lizards. Hearing this, his kin were perplexed and shocked, as they could not understand why he had decided to listen to their enemy. Seeing their confusion and panic, Owen told them to calm down and trust him, then informed them that the black-skinned lizards intended to crush the frogs. The grayish-brown scaled lizards were silent. Owen was the smartest among them, and they realized that even if this trickster risked everything, they should do the same. The tips of the lizards' wooden clubs caught fire, and in the next instant, the village of Toadmen was engulfed in flames. Shunin watched with shock and despair as his village burned. He still could not believe that Owen could betray him. Seeing that the gray scaly lizards had betrayed them, and that their situation was getting worse and worse, he gave his warriors the command to retreat. To which they asked how they could retreat when they had killed their warriors. However, Shunin's priority was his safety, for if his successor got into trouble, it would most likely be all over for the village. However, since it was the successor's order, they could not disobey, so grudgingly they began to prepare to withdraw. Turning to Shunin, one of them asked if they would join the Oboi warrior. However, he himself did not know the exact answer to this question. Although he had no doubts about his abilities, his intuition told him that in order to get rid of the black-skinned lizards, he needed a more reliable way. At the same time, the frog warrior Oboi was confused as the village burned while there was no word from the warriors preparing for the feast. By his assumptions, Shunin must have been continuing to fight. However, the problem was that the 10 warriors who were in the banquet hall, as well as the 5 others who went to check, were most likely dead. This left Shunin with about 15 more men, while there should have been 4 or 5 more on the island. Adding them together and adding his 10 warriors as well as the warriors from the upper-class village, the total should have been somewhere around 45, which meant that they still had the advantage. Instead of panicking, he began to encourage his warriors by telling them to put more poison on their arrows. After all they had to do was wait for Mr. Shunin to arrive, with whom they would retreat. But despite his confident words, his warrior intuition warned him of the approaching danger. And as it turned out, his intuition was not lying. The very next moment, a noise was heard in the bushes nearby. Quickly reacting, he immediately pointed his bow in the direction of the noise, shouting for the man who was sitting there to come out, threatening to shoot him. But behind his determination and threats was fear. He had the same feeling he had when he met Cockatrice, and his instincts told him to run. But he could not do so, for the next instant two large eyes flashed through the bushes. On seeing them, Bowboy immediately ordered his warriors to shoot at them. The warriors released the bowstrings of their bows, and the arrows flew at the enemy. But in the next instant, the faces of all the frogmans who saw what appeared before them were filled with fear and horror. Before them was a huge reptile, on the back of which sat several black, scaly lizards. The creature, with an arrow between its teeth, seemed to be smiling at them. The lizard behind Jael asked her if the arrow had wounded Manon, to which she smiled and said that it was probably just stuck between his teeth. Manon was still small and still had a habit of chewing everything in his mouth. But this was not the case with the arrow, and he immediately spat it out with a disgruntled look. Whether because the arrow was not tasty enough or for some other reason, he let out a furious growl the next moment. Jael pointed to the frightened and desperate toads and said that hadn't they been a good meal for him. The toads, not wanting to die, turned to their commander Oboy in a panic, asking what they should do, since arrows did not work on the creature. However, he himself did not know what to do. They had no time to think of a better plan, for the next moment Manon jumped on Oboy, who was closest to him. He was an experienced warrior, and a second before he died, he managed to dodge, which put the head of his inexperienced kin right in the reptile's mouth. Realizing that this monster was no match for Cockatrice, and that it was almost impossible to make eye contact with such a fast creature, he decided to throw poisonous toads into its jaws. Manon, like a dog seeing a bone thrown to him, instantly caught it and swallowed it. Thinking that the reptile was immune to poison, Oboy shouted to his warriors to throw all the poisonous frogs they had, which they immediately did. Not about to give up the free tasty snacks, Manon began to catch the frogs flying at him. Watching this performance with disdain, Jael asked the lizard behind her what they were doing, to which he replied that they were throwing poisonous frogs from their pouches. But she said that she had seen it herself, but what she was more interested in was why they were throwing their snacks around, which she thought was very strange. After a moment's thought, he replied that perhaps it was an act of goodwill. Jael grinned wickedly at this, then turned to Manon and told him to explain that it was too late for that. One of the blessings they had received from the god was the blessing of resistance to poisons, which was crucial at the moment. Seeing the evil smirk on Manon's face, who was looking at him like he was lunch, Oboy realized that his foolproof plan had failed, but there was no time to do anything about it. For in the next instant, the huge reptile leapt at him again, and this time without missing a beat. In the Frogman village, traces of blood could be seen everywhere on the ground. While their houses burned with fire, a frogman sitting in the bushes with a bow was aiming at someone. In the next instant, the arrow was speeding through the air towards its target, which was Rack, who was walking somewhere. However, even though he could not see the arrow coming at him, thanks to his excellent instincts he was able to sense the approaching danger and reflected it with his massive tail. While Ur, who had arrived in time, neutralized the archer with a single blow. When he approached Rack, he informed him that it looked like the frogman had been the last, adding that Shunin had indeed abandoned the village and fled when he sensed danger. To which he replied that one of the reasons for this was the betrayal of the Grey Lizards who were currently fighting against the frogmen with them. Then adding that even so they had no right to criticize them, as it was their choice. However, what he was really interested in, and what he thought was really strange, it was why, despite the criticality of their situation, the great alloy they had only heard about did not show up. Sun Moon, who was watching them from above, smiled shyly, pleased with himself. Then quietly muttered to himself that it was all because of him. Among the countless tactics and strategies used by him, there was one that was probably one of the strongest in the game, and it was called disease. It worked and was effective in any era. It was a tactic he decided to use this time. Even though he had some trouble finding the right virus, since it was only supposed to work on the mucous membranes of amphibians, he still managed to do it. The time when Rack followed the astrologer to the southeast, where the tribe of Frogman was located, coincided with the time when the protagonist discovered the virus. And even though the virus and the Frogman tribe were hundreds of kilometers apart, he successfully managed to transport it to them thanks to his insect army, who, despite many casualties along the way, eventually made it to their village, where he first infected their leader, the Great Oroi, who has since disappeared. At the same time, the sounds of drums could be heard around the island, banged by several frogmen. On the ground near the water, several bound gray lizard cubs were kneeling. Realizing they were here for sacrifice, they tearfully awaited their fate. Not far away on the ground sat the Great Oroi, whose body was covered with a layer of white mucus, and who had initiated the sacrifice that he believed would heal them. Together with a crowd of his tribesmen, who knelt before the lizard cubs, bowed and begged the two-headed god to accept their sacrifice, and to kill all those lizards, thus showing them his greatness. Soon, someone's huge shadow appeared under the water, with two pairs of eyes glowing in it. At the same time, Shunin reached the island by boat and saw that his father had already started the ritual of the living sacrifice, which he believed was the key to their victory. At the same time, in the nearly destroyed lower village of the Frogmen, Rakrak was called loudly by someone's excited and panting voice. Turning around, he saw Owen, who was breathing heavily from running. Praising Owen for a job well done, Rakrak asked him why he was in such a hurry and what he wanted from him. He said with desperation in his voice that they needed to get to the island right away. Rakrak was puzzled as to why they had to get to the island now, and he said that the frogmen had their cubs there to sacrifice. Then he added that they had a god, and that if they sacrificed to him, he would come and do them a small favor. And though he might not be able to cure their disease, he would probably attack him and his warriors. Rakrak sighed and said that he should have told him sooner, for now they had no way to get to the island, for Shunin had taken all the boats in his escape. Owen did not want to give up, and started to say that if they swam, they would be able to get to the island. But he was immediately interrupted by the harsh voice of Rakrak, who looked at him coldly and said that it was too dangerous, because they had bows, and they didn't swim as well as they did. Owen's eyes filled with despair at these words. And in the next instant, his fatherly instinct kicked in, making him beg him to help his son and the other children. However, this only made Rakrak angrier, who immediately punched him in the jaw. He shouted at him furiously, saying that he should have confided in him earlier and told him everything from the beginning. Then he told Owen, who looked at him with horror and despair on his face, that he believed that they could defeat the god the stupid frogs believed in by their own strength, and that if their god appeared and attacked them, he would show him how they could destroy him. When he calmed down and stopped shouting, he looked pityingly at the still sobbing Owen. Though he couldn't imagine his pain, he knew it was incredibly hard for him, so he just asked if he thought he should have told them earlier so they could have saved his son. At the same time, Jael stopped behind them, and after dealing with Obo, she got back on Manuna's horse. She immediately turned her worried gaze to the island in the middle of the lake. Owen didn't think Rakrak had said anything wrong, for he realized that things would have changed if he had only been able to learn of Shunin's intentions earlier. And perhaps if he hadn't acted so late, none of this would have happened. In the next instant, the water near the island was churning. The head of the Oroi tribe, shouting incomprehensible words, joyfully reached out to the creature that appeared from under the water. This creature turned out to be a two-headed devil, which was their god. Without wasting time, Oroi immediately pointed to the gray lizard cubs, seeing the monster, clung to each other in fear, and then he said in a reverent voice that it was his offering. Raising his hands in the air, he began to shout in a fanatical voice to punish the black-scaled lizards who dared to disturb the god's lake. Looking at the huge two-headed monster that looked invincible to him, Owen finally lost hope. However, while he resigned himself to his fate, Rakrak along with Jael looked at the two-headed devil with calm gazes. Despite its enormous size, Rakrak thought that fighting this 15-meter-long two-headed serpent might be worth a try. After all, even though they didn't have a topographical advantage and couldn't use any tricks, they had a chance to win, even if it cost some sacrifices. However, the very next instant, he noticed something that made his eyes widen wide and glow. A butterfly flew towards him, glowing with a blue light. This could only mean one thing: they had hope. Walking over to the desperate Owen, Rakrak called out to him and told him to look at him. He raised his head in bewilderment and looked at him with his tear-wet eyes, which widened the next moment at what he saw. Standing in front of the huge mantis that appeared before them in the moonlight, Rak turned to Owen and asked him if he believed in miracles. Kneeling before his god, Olroy shouted loudly to his tribe to worship the two-headed devil. He again began fanatically shouting to the monster to accept their offerings and destroy the lizards. Shunin bowed his head and watched as he approached the victims, but at one point the monster stopped in indecision and looked forward. With Aura's experience, this god had always been hungry for sacrifices, and always as if he had been starving for days, had rushed at them, but to his surprise, this time no such thing had happened. Wishing to know what the demon was looking at, he followed his gaze and turned around cautiously. His eyes widened at what he saw, and he instinctively froze with fear. There was a large shadow above the tall trees, belonging to a huge creature with large eyes, which at the mere sight of it inspired awe and terror. The sounds of this creature's movements were accompanied by the cracking sound of trees bursting out of the ground, which immediately made the frogmen bowing to the two-headed devil turn around. Like their leader, they also froze with fear when they saw the creature approaching them. Shivering in fear, someone from the crowd loudly exclaimed, "It's God." Their fear was understandable, for looking at this creature, it was clear that compared to him, the two-headed devil was just a pathetic water snake, while he really looked like a true god. When creating his creature that would follow his will, which was made possible by the fact that he had the essence of the abomination that was Skalopendra, Sun One decided to focus on practicality. Adding strong legs as well as wings, sharp jaws, and large eyes that allowed him to see in all directions. Although the resulting creature resembled a mantis, it was a completely different organism. He guessed that at that point there probably weren't many players who had been able to create their own creature before him. We'll go back to the two-headed demon, who was confused and furious when he saw the creature approaching him, because if he let the creature that had invaded his territory stay, he would have to give up the savages and the victims. And so even though his opponent seemed large and strong, he was not about to back down, for he himself was a divine being. Already in the next instant, it opened its jaws and rushed at him. Stretching out one of his arms, the mantis easily squeezed one of the heads of the snake that was trying to attack him. Crawling out onto the ground and colliding with the mantis, the snake crushed several frogmen with its body. Seeing this, the rest of them started to run away screaming in panic. Shunin barely managed to drag his father away. Despite the fact that he was almost killed, he continued to watch the monster fight with horror. Not wanting to give up so easily, the serpent opened its second mouth and tried to attack the mantis again. But like last time, it was not successful. The mantis neutralized the attacking head with one strong blow, then turning to the snake in a quiet voice, which despite this was heard by all the lizards near the lake. He said that if he dared to call himself a god, he should realize that he was in fact nothing. Aura and Shunan, who were watching, had a look of horror on their faces. Then grabbing the serpent's remaining head, which was still showing signs of life, the mantis said he would offer it to his creator, so that he could atone for his stupidity was not a sin. In the next moment, illuminated by the bright light of the moon, he pompously tore off its head. Then, under the gaze of all present, turning to the dead serpent, he said that his sins were forgiven by his blood and flesh. Even someone who was watching was surprised, as he didn't expect that he would win so easily. Because even though there was a big difference in skill and level, he still had high hopes for the two-headed devil. However, he decided to think about it later, because his main goal was to help the tribe of lizards, who saw the victory of their god and began to shout with joy, while Owen cried again. But this time with joy. Seeing the joy and happiness on the faces of the lizard men, Sun One thought to himself that the emotions he was experiencing were quite entertaining. Turning back to the corpse of the two-headed demon, he noted that his abilities weren't too bad, considering that he had a small area, not a large one, unlike the others. But he hadn't used it, which suggested that the reason was his creature, which was probably just too strong. Another reason to rejoice was the system window that appeared in the next moment, informing him that for killing the two-headed devil, he had received its essence, as well as the small area it possessed. In the next instant, another system window appeared in front of him, asking him if he wanted to check out the new territory. The fact that he was able to obtain another essence and a new territory so quickly could be attributed to nothing but luck. So without thinking long, Sun Wun confidently pressed yes. The next message that appeared after his choice made him unconsciously smile. After all, it said that he had obtained a small patch of water. However, the only problem was that he didn't need it now. Because the lake had no access to the sea, which made him decide to put it aside for now. A boat pulled away from the shore, the water red with blood. In it sat Roy, still trying to believe the truth of what was happening. Looking at his father, who seemed to have lost his mind after the death of the serpent, Shunin thought to himself that it was not the disease that had made his father weak. It was the fact that they were completely enchanted by the power of the two-headed devil, who at that moment seemed invincible to them. And at the last moment, they did nothing but hide behind him, and when he lost, there was nothing left for them to do. At the same time, someone approached the mantis. Seeing him and addressing him as the creator, said that he had done his will, to which he continued to look at the island and replied that he had indeed done an excellent job. Then he added that he could rest until the next time he called him. Disappearing, he said in a respectful voice that he would do his creator's will again when the time was right. He looked once more at the lake, which was silent. Sun Wu turned his gaze to Rak Rak and said that he was not the kind of lizard who did nothing at times like this. Seeing the surviving frogmen fleeing in boats to the upper village, Rak Rak cheered his warriors and shouted that they would win a complete victory today, then asked if there were any volunteers to take them to the upper village of the frogmen. He was immediately approached by Owen, who said that he wasn't that tired yet, and that he needed to meet his son on the island anyway, and said he would do so. But he was not the only one. The next moment several more gray lizards asked Rak Rak to let him help them as a thank you. He looked at them and replied that their bodies were not fit for battle and they would not be able to fight, to which one of them replied that he too had once been a warrior, adding that warriors were not the only ones capable of killing frogmen. Then pointing to his kin, who despite their wounds were willing to fight even with sticks in their hands, he said that he might think it was cowardice of them to do so only now, but the sight of them fighting made their hearts burn, the first time they had felt that way since becoming slaves. Looking at them, Rak Rak replied that it was like a grudge. To which the gray lizard tearfully replied that it was, for the hatred, resentment of losing their life companions, children and grandchildren, made them wish the frogmen dead. As he looked around at the gray lizards once more, he realized that few of them had ever held a real weapon, let alone been wounded, but understanding their pain and bitterness, he could not stop them. So in the next instant he raised his fist and shouted loudly, telling all those who wanted revenge to follow him, followed by the screams of the lizards who were intent on finishing off their abusers once and for all.